New York Giants head coach Brian Daboll took center stage at Tuesday's league meetings, and he talked about quite a few things. We're going to bring you a summary, some thoughts on what he had to say, plus who are the Giants going to miss the most out of all the free agents they lost? That's all coming your way next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, P-Train, and of course, I'm a credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for Giants Country over on the Fan Nation Network, part of SI.com. And a special welcome on in to my everydayers, my Blue Crew community members, my newcomers, and everybody in between. You are all appreciated and loved by yours truly. Thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day. If you watch on YouTube, your first watch of the day. And if we're not your first listen or watch, thank you all the same for spending time with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. We do appreciate you. Be sure to, if you are watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Make sure you click that little notification bell for any time I post new videos. And of course, like this video if you would. It helps us tremendously. All right, on today's Locked On Giants podcast, head coach Brian Daboll spoke to reporters at the league meeting on Tuesday morning. I'm going to break it into two segments here. So the first segment, we're going to talk about the mention of whether or not he's going to call plays. Now, I have opinions about what he might do, and I'm going to talk about the pros and cons about him potentially calling plays. So that'll be segment one. Segment two, Daboll spoke about constantly evolving, and we're going to talk a little bit about how he needs to grow or how he maybe is growing as a head coach. And then in segment three, we're going to kind of look back on free agency and specifically the free agents that the Giants lost. Who are they going to miss the most and why? So that's our agenda for today's show. Again, welcome on in. Let's jump right in. And we're going to kick things off with this whole notion about Brian Daboll potentially calling plays in 2024. Now, I said the minute that the season ended and the topic came up, and this was even before the Giants decided to promote Mike Kafka, offensive coordinator, to the role of assistant head coach, that I believe in year three, Brian Daboll would seriously consider taking over the play calling. It just made too much sense. All right. I say that because the Giants were coming off a very bad season offensively, in which they just did not put it all together. And I know, John Mara might say, well, they had injuries. Sorry. You're getting paid a salary to play in the NFL. You got to produce. All right. So I'm not buying the injury excuse as much maybe as the Giants organization would like to buy it. So Daboll, in taking over the offense, all right, it was a perfect storm, if you will. So now things are set up to where Daboll's got to produce. And he knows it. It's a results-oriented business. And if the offense continues to look sluggish, if it continues to lack explosiveness, that's going to be a problem. So Daboll, in taking control of the offense, now, again, he has not officially said he is going to take over the play calling. I believe he is going to. He says that they're still working through that, and they're probably going to go through it in the springtime, experiment, maybe even into training camp. An experiment. I think he's doing it, folks. I'd be stunned if Mike Kafka retains the play calling role. So what are the advantages, the pros and cons of Daboll taking over the play calling? Well, again, this is a make or break year for the Giants. They have got to produce. So if you're Daboll, you're going to do everything possible to make sure that your offense produces. If it means taking on the play calling, so be it. He promoted Mike Kafka, like I said, to assistant head coach. Kafka's going to have some additional responsibilities. All right. Shea Tierney, by the way, is the passing game coordinator. That's some of the stuff that the offensive coordinator would do. So everything is kind of set up to pave the way for Daboll to take over the play calling in 2024. But most importantly, there's this, okay? Daboll's got a track record, a successful track record as a play caller. When he was with Buffalo, he called plays for 4 straight years. They made the playoffs 3 times, won 2 division titles, made it to the conference championship game in one of those years. The Giants offense, you look at the production over the last 2 years, 18.6 points per game. Not good enough, not in the least. And last year, 15.6 points per game. That's definitely not good enough. So if this is a make or break year for Daboll, as some may think it is, that offense needs to produce. And if he's going to, get more involved, put his fingerprints all over that offense, he's going to make sure that if he goes down, he's going to go down on his own terms, so to speak. So the system is set up. And then there's the other factor. If they bring in a new quarterback, a young quarterback in this draft class, and all signs seem to be pointing to that being the case, Daboll's going to want to put his fingerprints all over that quarterback, similar to what he did with Josh Allen up in Buffalo. So it just makes too much sense. You have Daboll calling the plays, setting things up a little differently, maybe than Mike Kafka would. Kafka handles, the assistant coaching duties, whatever they may be on game day. And, Daboll, again, sets himself up to where if he's going to go down, he's going to go down on his own terms, as opposed to on the heels of Mike Kafka or somebody else who might be calling the plays. So it just makes too much sense for Daboll to not take over the play calling. And that's the direction it is headed in. Now, what are the disadvantages of him taking over the play calling? Number one, game management. All right. I think back to when Ben McAdoo was calling plays and Pat Shurmur was calling plays. They always had their face buried in that card, that play calling card. So you could tell they were always like thinking one play ahead, one series ahead. Ergo, they were not able to really manage the entire game. So even though they had experienced coordinators, on defense and special teams calling their parts, you still want the head coach available if you need to consult with something. Okay. So, that would be a concern of mine. Another concern is game management. When to call a timeout, when to call for a challenge. I mean, if Daboll's going to take over the play calling, he better have himself a good quality control coach who can direct him on all that stuff. Now, they did try that last year. They had some hiccups along the way with certain challenges and certain decisions that were called and whatnot. So they need to make sure that they tighten that part of the game up. Those are really, as far as I see it, the 2 main challenges if Daboll takes over the play calling. He's not going to be as involved, I don't think, with, what's going on the sideline. And, I've spoken in the past about being in favor of the head coach being a CEO type of head coach, somebody who's available to everybody. And I think if Daboll were to take on the play calling role, that might get scaled back a little bit. The good news is this is year 3 of the same offensive system. It's not like it's year 1, year 2, where everybody was learning. You're going to have some new pieces as always, but primarily your skill position players, for the most part, are going to be the same. Your offensive line is going to change up a little bit, but you're not talking wholesale changes per se to where maybe it's as big of a deal. So, there's pros and cons. I think in this case, the pros outweigh the cons. And again, I think Daboll set this up with all intentions of taking over the play calling for the Giants in 2024. All right, coming up next, Daboll spoke about needing to evolve. I have some thoughts about that as well. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Hey, Giant fans, if you're having trouble finding those last-minute tickets to your favorite concerts, shows, and sporting events, Game Time has you covered. They offer a wide selection of seats, complete with seat views to help you decide where you want to sit, and they're constantly offering last-minute tickets through flash deals. There are no hidden fees. You're going to know exactly what your deal is before you check out. And Game Time even has tickets available as late as an hour after an event starts, making it truly the best place to find last-minute deals at amazing prices. Want more reasons to trust Game Time? They offer event cancellation protection, and if you find your tickets in the same section and row for less elsewhere, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So go on and take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Terms apply. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And coming up on the Locked On Giants podcast this week, I'm scheduled to speak with Brad Spielberger. He Pro Football Focus. He also does some work over the Cap. So we're going to talk about the Giants free agent hauls, the value that they got, just the way the team is set up. We're going to talk obviously about the draft. So always good to get different perspectives on the show. I think, even though, pretty much the same questions, but it's still different perspectives from different draft analysts and experts in the field. So Brad Spielberger is scheduled to be on with me. That would be probably tomorrow's show. So that is the game plan. And of course, we are still Monday through Friday here on the Locked On Giants podcast. There is no off season for us. We don't stop. You demand the shows, I bring them to you. So here we are. So, all right. In this segment, Brian Daboll is our main topic. And Daboll, one of the topics he spoke about at the league ownership meeting is his evolution. Now, I have a saying that I like to, apply to myself, and I think it applies in this case to Daboll as well, that if you're not growing, if you're not evolving, you're dead. And it's true. Think about it. We as people change from year to year, from decade to decade. Things change. I know when I was a kid, I like to eat vegetables. Now that I'm an adult, I hate vegetables. You also look at, how you handle different situations, both good and bad. So what does this have to do with Daboll, you ask? Well, Daboll in his first couple of years, the first year, everything was kind of hunky-dory. The team was winning. Daboll went on to win Coach of the Year. And then last year, the bottom fell out. The Giants were not very good. It was a perfect storm of just, one bad thing after another. Daboll's competitiveness, his fiery attitude, it came into the spotlight. And there were some that questioned whether he was a little over the top and a little out of control. Now, my personal feeling is that while I appreciate the competitiveness that Daboll shows, that, it shows that he cares and whatnot, there are certain things that you need to get under control. You can't just keep popping corks every time something goes wrong. You do that, you're gonna give yourself, a heart attack or something, worse. So I always felt that Daboll, sometimes he got a little carried away. And I got the impression just in hearing, what he had to say, that maybe he realizes that sometimes he's a little over the top. And it's interesting because even John Mara said, at times he could be over the top, but John Mara also said that he didn't feel the need to necessarily sit down with Daboll and talk to him about, his behavior on the sidelines. A few weeks ago, when I had OC Humanura on the show, OC made a good point, and I want to reiterate it here. You can't talk to people today the way you might have been able to talk to them 10, 15, 20 years ago. All right. What was acceptable then isn't acceptable now. You've got, all these movements and whatnot, and you have to kind of be careful and diplomatic with how you talk to people. And, Daboll, for the most part, from everything I gathered, inside the building, he's fine. He's not, the culture is good. He's not, this tyrant that has everybody walking around on eggshells. Now, when a team loses, like the Giants were stuck in a losing rut last year, yeah, maybe things are a little bit more sensitive and a little bit more, delicate, if you will. But Daboll, one of the things he's got to differentiate, in my opinion, is it's one thing to yell, it's another thing to embarrass. And, the camera's always going to be on you, especially, it's kind of like the offensive lineman who develops a reputation for holding, and now all of a sudden he has a target on his back with the officials. It's the same thing now with Daboll. Last year, he was caught on camera, yelling at players, or there was the famous flipping of the tablet after going over a play with Daniel Jones, where he just took a tablet and kind of flung it off to the side angrily. There were the icy stare downs at former special teams coordinator Thomas McGahee. Deserve it or not, things like this got caught on camera. So now, if you're part of the television crew directing, the various shots, you're probably going to tell your camera people, have the camera on the Giants sideline, and in particular on Daboll at all times, because you never know when you're going to catch him in a moment where he just overreacts or acts in such a way that, it makes for good viewing or makes for a meme on social media. So look, it's okay to be competitive. It's okay to yell at, to yell if and express yourself if a play doesn't go according to plan, or if you don't get the call that you need or whatnot. It's not okay though to basically throw yourself on the ground and have a temper tantrum. And that's where I think Dable kind of needs to differentiate a little bit. He just a healthy amount of competitiveness is good. It never hurt anybody. But when you start to just get carried away, that's when, look, you got to take this into consideration. Your team is looking to you as the leader to set the tone. If you get out of control, what's to say that your players won't subtly follow that and go get out of control? If you see your coach screaming and getting in the face of the officials, and again, no matter whether it's justified or not, what's to stop the players from saying, well, coach did it. If he could do it, I could do it. That's where I get concerned with some of the competitiveness. And to Daboll's credit, he spoke about evolving as a leader, evolving as a person, trying to be the best version of himself. And that's what he needs to be. This team cannot have him blowing his stack at every time something goes wrong, no matter how big or small it is. They need him to be composed, still be competitive, but there are other ways you can be competitive. Now, how can he be competitive? Cheering guys on, clapping his hands. It's okay if somebody messes up to just, kind of pump your fist in frustration. But, just getting in a guy's face, I mean, save that for behind closed doors if you're going to do that. Because again, it's one thing to yell. All coaches do it and players know that it's coming. It's another thing to seek to embarrass. And whether Daboll, I don't believe he's seeking to embarrass purposely, but that kind of behavior can lead to that. And I know that, speaking for myself, if somebody came at me like that, I'd be like, okay, you calm down and then talk to me like an adult. So, there's a degree of, respect in there. And I just think, I know Daboll realizes that. And for the record, I don't think Daboll's a bad guy. I happen to like the guy. I like his competitiveness, but you got to calm down. You got to reel it in a little bit. Otherwise, you run the risk of people just not only walking on eggshells, but if somebody's constantly on your back, constantly yelling at you or making you look foolish, are you really going to want to play for that guy or run through a brick wall for that guy at the end of the day? Probably not. So that's where the fine balancing act comes into play with, being fiery, being competitive, being, a vocal voice, talking to your team and whatnot, and being a jerk. So, I'm not saying Daboll's a jerk. He is not, but you got to be careful that your behavior doesn't wade into that territory. And that's something, to his credit, he knows that he has to fix. He knows that he's, something he's reflected on. And I think he will get better at that and be the best version of himself in good times and bad moving forward. All right, coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast, the Giants lost some free agents, as you know. So who are they going to miss the most? I'm going to give you a couple, some of whom may or may not surprise you. That's coming up right after this. Hey, Giant fans, say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And if you missed it yesterday, I'm going to say it again today. Thank you for such a humongous month here on the Locked On Giants podcast. Record-setting numbers on all our shows, particularly on YouTube. So thank you all for your support. And also, speaking of the YouTube channel, my hope had been to hit 10,000 subscribers before training camp, and I thought, okay, maybe I won't hit it because I was close. We're rocketing up the charts. I mean, we can't have the Cowboys beating me in the count, right? So please, again, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell, like our videos. It all helps because the Cowboys can't be beating the Giants. I mean, eventually we got to start beating them on the field, but at least we can beat them here on the Locked On Network, right? So please do me that favor if you will. All right, on this segment, the Giants lost some free agents, as we know. Who are they going to miss the most? Now, I narrowed this down to 4 guys that I'm going to talk about. Some of whom are the obvious guys, and some of whom maybe you don't think are as obvious. And I'm going to mention each guy and whether I think they're going to be really missed or maybe not as missed. Obviously, I'm going to start with Xavier McKinney, the safety. That's the guy the Giants are going to miss. And here's why I think they're going to miss him. Not only because of the versatility he brought to the table, but, right now, I think Dane Belton is going to be the guy that is going to fill in for Xavier McKinney, the guy that's going to take over that starting role. At least he's the incumbent right now. I question if Belton can hold up to the rigors like McKinney did. You look at the injuries that McKinney had, the hand injury, that was a fluke accident that he had during the bye week. His rookie season, he had the broken leg in training camp. For the most part, McKinney held up to the physical nature of the game. He was versatile. He played a variety of roles. I think the Giants are going to miss that. I really do. And, that doesn't mean Belton can't be a good player for them. But my big concern there is, does he have the durability to hold up to the demands of that position? All right. Saquon Barkley also has to be on the list. Are the Giants going to miss him? I'm going to say a little bit, but not as much as maybe some other people would say. And the reason is for this. Saquon Barkley, you go back and you look at how his snap counts kind of started to drop a little bit, how they last year kind of took him off of third down. That, they can make up for all that, and I think they will depending on who ends up being the better pass protector. Devin Singletary can certainly do that. Barkley was a special talent. I'm not disputing that, but he was also a boom or bust type of runner. And I don't know about you, but I would rather have a guy who was consistent in picking up yardage as opposed to a boom or bust runner. And, Barkley in the passing game, they didn't really use him as much as they did, the first year he was in the league under, Pat Shurmur. So I think, his production, the yards, the role that he played, I think that can all be replaced. And look, what you miss about Barkley, obviously, is he was a great locker room presence. He was a leader, well-liked by his teammates. You miss that. You miss the fact that he was, the face of the franchise. You miss the fact that he was, the marketing key. But that's all off-field stuff. I'm talking on-field stuff. And I just feel like the Giants can maybe replace some of that with Singletary and some of the other guys that they have. So we'll have to see. I think, Barkley will do well in Philadelphia, and, he will do well enough to maybe make a liar out of me on this. But here, I just think that, the decision to not overpay for him, I think it was the right move. All right, I've got 2 guys now that maybe nobody's thinking about, but I'm going to throw it out here for you. I think they're going to miss Tyrod Taylor. Now, Tyrod Taylor obviously went to the Jets on a 2-year deal. which I think has some voidable years after that. Taylor, yes, the guy was always injured when he had to go in and play. So again, you talk about that durability and him holding up, versus Drew Lock, and Drew Lock hold up better if he has to play. But Tyrod Taylor, I just feel like maybe at that point, a little better, more accomplished quarterback, a guy who had seen a lot more. If you were to ask me to pick between Locke and Tyrod Taylor as the backup, I probably would go with Taylor, even though again I know his durability is a question mark. So I just felt like Taylor, professional in the locker room. He was helpful with the systems and stuff like that, having had that exposure in Buffalo. So, I just think the Giants are going to miss that. Now, that's not to say that Drew Lock can't get up to speed and be just as good and be just as, or if not a better option than Tyrod Taylor, but I just feel the Giants are going to miss that in Tyrod Taylor. So, all right, the last guy I want to talk about, offensive lineman Ben Bredeson. Now, a lot of you are going to say, well, he was part of that horrible offensive line that they had last year. I was hoping they would bring Ben Bredeson back as a depth piece because of his versatility at both guards and center. Now, the Giants replaced him with guys that can play guard and center. I get that. And they're probably just as good, if not better. But I don't know. Again, I have this thing about keeping as much intact as you can without, obviously upgrade where you need to. But Bredesen, I would have liked to have seen maybe in a reserve role. And, the Giants went out and they got these other guys. And I believe in Carmen Brasillo. I believe he can turn these guys into, functional offensive linemen. But I just hated to see Bredesen go. I felt that he was just, always undervalued, always underappreciated. And I get it, folks. He was part of the historically bad offensive line. I understand that. But, I just felt like, there were times when Bredesen was assignment sound. He was solid. Did he struggle with athleticism and quickness? Yes. But, for the most part, could you win with the guy in the lineup? You probably could. They did a couple years ago. So I don't know. I just felt like that's the guy that they're going to miss, but they're not, I'm not going to say they're going to miss him maybe as much as McKinney or maybe as much as Taylor, but I think that's the guy that you miss. So that's my take on Ben Bredeson. Those are the four guys that I think the Giants are going to miss. And in order of who's they're going to miss the most, obviously McKinney. I think you go with him. Number 2, you go with Tyrod Taylor. I think you go with Bredeson, number 3, and Saquon, number 4. No disrespect to Saquon, but I do believe they can maybe replace some of that with more consistency as opposed to that boomer bust type of player that Saquon tended to be at times. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. As always, thank you for making us your first listener of the day, or if you're watching YouTube, your first watch of the day, or for tuning in, regardless of how you get your content. Don't forget, tomorrow we are scheduled to have Brad Spielberger on the show, and I will see you tomorrow, Giant fans.